Leon Barrett wasn't a man who needed much from the world beyond the horizon of his land. For as long as he could remember, the mountains at the edge of his ranch were the only borders that mattered. His family had worked these same dusty hills and stubborn pastures since his grandfather bought them during the lean, bitter years after the Dust Bowl. The soil wasn't forgiving, but it was honest, and it never lied to a man willing to dig deep and plant roots. Over the decades, barns had collapsed and been rebuilt, fences had been scorched and hammered back into place, and the wind had never once stopped coming down from the hills like a breath from something older than law or government. Leon didn't need much, and he didn't offer much to the world in return, just the understanding that what was his stayed his. The land had always been enough. It was there in the sound of cicadas spinning invisible threads across the dusk, in the scent of sweet hay and diesel, in the thud of his boots against dry earth, in the way the horizon never felt like a wall. He never married, not because he couldn't, but because there was always something else needing fixing, mending, welding, or digging. That didn't bother him. The ranch had been faithful. He didn't need more than that. What a man owns, what he builds with his hands and names as his own, should be sacred. And that land, every stubborn acre of it, was his gospel. Then came the signs. Not figurative omens, but literal signs. Tall, clean-cut, industrial signs that stood at the edges of the county road like they had been grown from some different kind of soil. They were slick, metal-framed, with branding so polished it reflected the sun like a mirror to the future. Whispering Creek Estates, private community access only. Leon had passed them a few times without much concern. Some developer buying up scrubland near the highway, most likely, not his problem. His land wasn't part of any community. He had no homeowners association breathing down his neck, no neighborhood meetings, no obligations to any collective vision of lifestyle or aesthetics. His roads were gravel, his mail came once a week, and he dealt with his own problems the same way he dealt with coyotes in the chicken coop, swiftly and without discussion. Still, something about the signs left a sour taste. He didn't like the idea of someone else putting up words on land that used to be empty. Roads around here didn't change unless someone wanted something, and people who wanted things usually brought headaches. But Leon kept his head down. He had more important things to deal with. The southern fence needed repair, and there was a new clutch on the grain truck that wasn't going to replace itself. His days were spoken for, and his nights were filled with the quiet he'd earned. The warning shot came in silence. He was coming back from the feed store, sun high and sweat streaking down the inside of his collar, when his tires hit something unfamiliar just before the turnoff to his drive. A bump, sharper than gravel, too deliberate. He stopped the truck, stepped out, and stared at a row of orange pylons placed neatly across what had always been his access road. Behind them was a steel gate, not yet locked but already bolted into the dirt with industrial brackets. No one had called him, no letter, no knock on the door, just a gate where there hadn't been one yesterday. The pylons bore the same branding as the signs by the highway. Leon stood there for a long time, longer than he usually allowed himself to waste. The wind kicked up a swirl of grit around his boots, and a hawk shrieked from somewhere above, too high to see. The gate wasn't on his land. Not quite, but it was close enough to matter. The road that ran beside it had always been unpaved, narrow, and dusty. It cut through what used to be county easement, and Leon's family had used it for 3 generations without interruption. It was the only reliable access road during spring thaw, when the back trails turned to sludge. It wasn't his land by deed, but it was his by legacy, by habit, by unwritten law. He didn't say anything, not then. He walked around the gate, stepped over a fresh trench dug beside the road, and made the slow climb up toward the ranch house. His dog, Murphy, met him halfway, tail low and ears up. The air smelled like concrete dust and new wires. Someone had been here working fast while he was gone. That night he didn't eat. He sat on the porch with a rusted thermos of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring out into the dark that now felt different. He could see the orange pylons from here, dim outlines against the stars. It wasn't the gate itself that rattled him. It was the audacity, the complete dismissal of process, of decency, of knocking on a man's door and explaining your intentions. Someone had made a choice that didn't involve him, on land that was part of his world, and if they thought silence would buy them anything, they were wrong. The next morning, Leon drove into town, not to make noise, but to make inquiries. Courthouse, zoning office, recorder's desk. He wasn't looking for confrontation, just a record, a scrap of paper that explained what the hell was going on. The clerk, a young man in too tight sleeves and an air of forced professionalism, looked uncomfortable when Leon spelled out the name of the development. "Ah," the clerk said, eyes flicking down to his screen. "Whispering Creek Estates." That's part of a recent land adjustment project. They consolidated a few unused parcels and got approval for limited access development. Private roads, restricted traffic. It's all in the system. Leon didn't speak. He just stared. They filed for exclusive use on the Old County Service Trail. Got it approved under expedited review. I think they bundled it under an infrastructure optimization clause. Leon blinked slowly. "That's my access road." The clerk gave a helpless shrug. Technically, it wasn't deeded to anyone, just an easement. They bought the parcels on both sides and applied for reclassification. And they got it. Yeah. Signed off 2 weeks ago. Leon thanked him, though the word left his mouth like gravel. On the way home, he didn't turn on the radio. He didn't speak to Murphy when the dog climbed into the truck bed. He just drove. The land didn't look different, but it felt it. Like someone had shuffled the ground beneath his boots while he wasn't watching. By the time he pulled up the drive, something had settled in him. Cold and slow and immovable. He wasn't going to wait for permission. He wasn't going to write letters or beg for meetings. He was going to make his intentions clear, just like they had, with steel and action. Because when a man's land is taken from him inch by inch, not with guns or noise but with paperwork and quiet gates, there comes a point where words stop working. And when that time came, Leon knew exactly which key to turn, which machine to wake up, and which path to clear. The gate wouldn't last the week. Leon didn't take action right away, not because he was unsure of what to do, but because he knew instinctively that what he did next would have to count. The kind of people who moved gates and reclassified land without knocking didn't back down when asked politely. He wasn't going to waste energy demanding explanations from men who operated behind tinted glass and under different names in different states. What he needed now wasn't outrage. It was leverage. 2 days passed, and the new gate went from a temporary inconvenience to a hardened fixture. Steel posts were reinforced with poured concrete overnight, and fresh wiring now looped through the structure. Motion sensors were installed. Leon's trail cameras caught the flicker of infrared beams dancing across the road when no one was around. He hadn't received a single phone call, no email, not even a notice in the mail acknowledging the blockade. It was as if someone had decided he was no longer important enough to inform. Or worse, they assumed he would simply comply. That miscalculation was going to cost them. On the third morning, he drove his pickup out the long way, circling behind his neighbor's lower pasture and kicking up enough dust to earn a few stares. At the county records office, the clerk he'd spoken with days earlier looked uneasy when Leon walked in again, this time with a stack of maps and copies of a notarized land survey from 1981. Leon laid everything out on the counter, his voice even but firm, pointing to the access road in question. "This, right here. We've been using it for over 40 years. My father before me. It's the only dry way in during thaw. This isn't a convenience. This is essential access. I need to see who authorized the reclassification and under what conditions." The clerk adjusted his glasses, glanced toward the back office, and then leaned slightly over the counter. "There's not much I can give you that you don't already know." It was a fast-track infrastructure grant. The application came through a Denver-based development firm, Crescent Ridge Holdings. They filed under a regional improvement program last year, bundled it with other rural developments, and got automatic review waiver based on statewide housing incentives. It went through in under 30 days. Leon didn't flinch. He took the folder back and nodded once, not wasting another word. That kind of process didn't happen without someone pulling strings. On his way back to the truck, he saw a familiar figure standing across the lot. Craig Norwood, local surveyor and one of the few people Leon would actually trust with a boundary line. Craig was older, always wore the same navy field vest, and kept a folder of handwritten notes thicker than most law textbooks. Leon walked over. "You heard about Whispering Creek?" Leon asked, his voice low. Craig nodded. "I turned down a contract from them 2 months ago. They wanted me to verify a couple of lines out by the reservoir. Offered twice my normal rate. Told them I didn't touch anything that starts with an NDA." Leon rubbed his jaw. "They're blocking my road." Craig didn't look surprised. "I figured that was coming. They tried something similar near Aspen Ridge, cut off access to 3 properties claiming the road was now part of a conservation easement. Took a judge's order to reverse it, and by then, 2 of the families had already moved out." Leon's eyes narrowed. "Did they fight?" "They tried. One of them was an older widow. They buried her in injunctions until her lawyer quit." Craig paused. "But you, I don't think you're going to roll over." Leon didn't answer. He didn't need to. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table with Murphy curled up underfoot, going over every deed, map, invoice, and property survey he'd kept for decades. He poured himself black coffee and worked by lamplight. The house creaked around him with the wind, the same sound he'd known since childhood, but it didn't feel familiar tonight. The land was still there, the barn still leaning, the soil still dry, but something was pushing in from the edges. A pressure, a hand reaching to erase what he knew and replace it with contracts, access restrictions, and a monthly fee for the right to exist where he'd always existed. This wasn't just about a gate. It was about ownership, identity, respect. He found the original easement mention buried in a survey dated 1979, unsigned but recorded in the county logbook. That was his wedge. The next morning, he returned to the site with a contractor friend, Ben, who brought a compact drone with a high-resolution lens. Together, they surveyed the surrounding fence lines and the new construction layout. The footage confirmed what Leon suspected. Not only had the developers blocked the road, but they had also extended their sensor perimeter 6 feet onto his property. Tiny solar sensors, barely noticeable to the naked eye, had been placed in the brush near his fence posts. They were watching. He printed stills from the drone footage, marked the GPS coordinates, and filed an affidavit of intrusion with the county. He didn't expect action from the local government, but it was a move he had to make. A paper trail mattered, even if no one wanted to follow it. That afternoon, he drove into the nearest town with a small legal firm he'd worked with before, mostly wills and title cleanups. The attorney, a quiet woman named Dana Morrow, took one look at the folder Leon handed her and raised an eyebrow. "They've already done this in 2 other counties," she said after reviewing the documents. "Same playbook, same shell company. The key is in the title transfer language. They use a modified covenant overlay that isn't flagged unless someone's watching closely. The trick is, they don't technically steal the land. They just make yours inaccessible." Leon leaned forward. "How do we make it stop?" Dana paused. "You file for an injunction, sure, but they'll delay, appeal, bury you in filings. The only quick way is to make it more costly for them to fight than to concede." Leon exhaled slowly. "Good. Then let's make it costly." On the way back from the lawyer's office, Leon noticed something new. A white SUV idling at the turnoff to his property. Two men stood near the gate, dressed too well for field work, hands on hips, watching. When they saw his truck approaching, they didn't wave or smile. They simply stepped into the SUV and drove off slowly, the kind of exit meant to be noticed. He watched them disappear into the haze. That night, the air changed again. It wasn't dramatic. No threats, no vandalism, just a different feeling, like being studied. When he stepped outside to feed the horses, he found a new tire track along the tree line where no one should have been. Someone had come close. He called Dana the next morning. "We escalate. I want formal notice delivered to their office, certified, and I want that drone footage embedded in every complaint." "We'll start today," she replied. "But Leon, don't provoke them." "Not yet." Leon didn't respond, because it was already too late for that. They'd drawn first blood. He was just drawing the line. The following days hardened something in Leon that had already been firm. He was not a man given to panic or drama, but what he began to witness confirmed his instinct. This wasn't just about one blocked road or even a land grab. It was about domination, methodical, rehearsed, and corporate. He recognized the tempo. It was the same rhythm used in other takeovers, except this one didn't happen with boardroom votes or lawsuits. It was happening slowly, incrementally, with the dull efficiency of machinery that didn't care who or what it ran over. The quiet pressure built not with threats but with assumptions, that the people who had lived on the land would comply, because fighting was expensive, confusing, and thankless. But Leon had already made the decision. He wasn't going to out-talk them. He was going to outlast them. The first overt move came early one morning when he noticed two white markers staked into the ground 15 feet inside his eastern fence line. They were bright plastic, driven deep and labeled with fluorescent flags that read, "Utility Locate, Water Phase B." The phrase meant nothing to him at first, but the GPS coordinates told a different story. These markers were not on anyone's paper plans. They weren't where any legal infrastructure should be. Leon paced the line of his fence, then stepped back across it to the markers. A new section of pipe lay nearby, still in plastic wrapping, stashed just beyond the edge of a trail used only by his cattle. No warning, no request, no explanation. He photographed it all. He called Dana, and within the hour she drove out herself with a clipboard, tape measure, and 2 interns. Together they surveyed the intrusion and matched it against the county parcel maps. What they discovered was even more invasive than Leon expected. A subcontractor working on behalf of Crescent Ridge Holdings had submitted a revised layout proposal that extended a water supply trench through multiple private plots, including his. It hadn't been approved yet, but work had already begun. Dana was furious in her quiet way, her tone clipped and surgical. "They're skipping the process entirely. They assume no one will notice until it's buried and operational. Then they'll file a post-installation easement claim and settle the fee in court. It's textbook. They're building forward on risk." Leon's response was simple. "Not on my land." He called Ben again, and within hours they had 6 cameras set up across the fence line, each disguised and positioned with overlapping views. Infrared, motion-triggered, night and day coverage. If the developers returned, there would be no "he said, she said." They would be caught in the act. That night, Leon didn't sleep in the house. He set up a cot in the barn with a thermos of coffee and a revolver near his cot. Not because he wanted violence, but because someone needed to stand where the boundary was drawn. Around 3:17 a.m., one of the sensors triggered. Leon opened the monitor and watched in silence. 3 men in reflective vests moved along the fence line. They didn't speak. One carried a handheld device that scanned the ground. Another began hammering a small post into the soil. The third made a call, his face just visible in the infrared light. Leon noted the time, the placement, the tools. Then he waited. 5 minutes later, they vanished, slipping back down the same trail toward the road. Leon downloaded the footage, made copies on 3 separate USB drives, and stored them in different places. He also emailed one directly to Dana. Subject line: 317 trespass confirmed. The next day, when he returned from picking up feed in town, Leon found that the gate had changed again. This time it wasn't just steel and sensors. It had a full keypad lock system and a camera mounted on top. A laminated notice had been zip-tied to the fence. Authorized access only. Private development zone. All unapproved entry will be reported. No letterhead, no signature, just the assumption of power. Later, that same day, he received his first formal letter, an envelope dropped directly in his mailbox bearing no return address, no stamp, just a printed sheet that read like a threat disguised as an invitation. "Dear property holder," it began, "in light of ongoing community infrastructure expansion, you are cordially invited to enter into cooperative easement negotiations with the Whispering Creek Planning Committee. Refusal to participate may result in legal action, limited access, or revocation of non-resident usage rights under adjusted jurisdiction codes." Leon read it once, twice, and then fed it to the fire barrel behind his shed. But even as he fought the visible intrusions, something else began to change. The tone of the people around him. Neighbors he'd known for years stopped waving from their porches. The mail delivery was delayed twice in 1 week. The feed store owner, a man who had once shared beers with Leon during branding season, now looked through him as if greeting a stranger. Someone was whispering behind closed doors, seeding quiet doubts. He's difficult. He won't adapt. Maybe he's just bitter because progress passed him by. At first, Leon brushed it off, but the pattern grew. Orders were misfiled. Deliveries missed his address entirely. And when he called a local fencing supplier to schedule new posts, he was told they no longer serviced his sector due to new development constraints. It wasn't incompetence, it was isolation. Someone was making him radioactive. So Leon escalated. He posted a new sign at the edge of his property. Simple, clear, legal, private land. All activity recorded. Trespassers will be prosecuted. He forwarded the same language to the sheriff's department and made a public filing noting encroachment and surveillance. That filing went to the county commission, and he made sure to include a copy of the drone footage, time-stamped and verified. But the strangest moment came a week later when he returned home to find that the trench along the eastern fence had been filled in. Not by him, not by Ben, not by the county. Freshly packed soil, smoothed over, the utility markers removed. It was as if someone had come to erase the evidence. Quietly, efficiently, like it had never been there. And yet, 2 of his cameras were gone. Not broken, not smashed. Gone. Posts unscrewed, memory cards missing. Only 1 camera had caught anything. A single frame of a man in a high-vis vest looking straight into the lens with calm disinterest before the feed cut out. Leon didn't show anger. He just stood by the empty post for a long time. The land around him was quiet again. But it wasn't peace. It was the silence of calculation. He called Dana. "They're getting surgical," he said. Her voice was sharper than usual. "We'll hit back. We'll file an emergency injunction for property preservation. I'll draft it tonight." Leon nodded slowly, staring out across the hills. "Do it fast. They're moving quicker than the courts." And though he didn't say it aloud, he knew the next step wasn't going to be in writing. It was going to be in action. 3 weeks into the standoff, the situation shifted. Subtly at first, like the change in wind before a storm breaks over the plains. Leon woke one morning to find that the gravel path from the main road to his cattle paddock had been paved overnight. Not with quality material or clean lines, but with patchy asphalt, poured haphazardly and left to bake under the sun without proper finish. At first glance, it could be mistaken for a favor, a gesture of development, improvement even. But Leon saw it for what it was, an insertion of control. They were marking his ground, placing their hand on his property without permission and pretending it was progress. No letter, no workers in sight, just tar and stone spread across land that had never asked for it. The implication was clear. He had no say. This wasn't just a company laying pipe anymore. It was an orchestrated effort to wear him down, mentally and practically, to exhaust his resolve until he accepted their authority over his land by attrition. Dana filed a complaint with the county that same day, and within 72 hours they received a curt response. The pavement had been mistakenly laid in anticipation of a mutual use agreement, which Leon had, of course, never seen or signed. The letter ended with an offer to retroactively negotiate terms of compliance, which Dana crumpled and tossed into her bag without reading aloud. It was that same afternoon, in the heat of a sun that burned off whatever goodwill remained in his bones, that Leon made a decision that would end the stalemate. He didn't want just to slow them anymore. He wanted to expose them, and that meant reaching higher. A week earlier, a woman named Catherine Wright had left a message on his landline. She claimed to be a freelance legal researcher working with a regional property rights coalition. He'd ignored her call at the time. Too many outsiders with solutions had tried to insert themselves into the mess, and he wasn't interested in being someone's case study or political chess piece. But now, with legal channels moving too slowly and the enemy encroaching faster than the courts could write back, he called her. To his surprise, she didn't pitch anything. She asked questions. Good ones, specific. Not about him, but about the land, about the original survey boundaries, about the pattern of construction permits and the corporate structure of Crescent Ridge Holdings. When he answered, she listened, fully, directly, without the pretense of sympathy or arrogance. It was transactional, but in the right way. By the end of the conversation, Leon had agreed to meet her in town. They sat at a quiet booth in a diner 30 miles from his ranch. She had a slim laptop and a folder full of diagrams, dates, and names Leon hadn't seen before. What she showed him reframed the whole battle. Crescent Ridge Holdings, it turned out, was a shell company. One of 5 under a holding group based out of Atlanta, which had funneled rural development funds through a federal grant system designed for low-income housing projects. But instead of building homes, the funds were rerouted to purchase land around legacy properties, like Leon's, and reclassify them for infrastructure cohesion. They weren't just trying to steal his access road. They were assembling a seamless corridor of private control across the region, one fence at a time. Even more disturbing, Catherine showed him records of similar plays in counties all over the state. 5 families displaced in the past year under involuntary easement violations. 3 of those cases never went to court. 2 never even made it to the news. "This isn't about you," she said flatly. "You're just on the map. The longer you hold out, the more their other projects stall. You're a bottleneck. That's why they're escalating." Leon stared at the map. His ranch, outlined in red, looked like a grain of sand in a concrete sea. "Why help me?" he asked finally. She didn't hesitate. "Because if this works on you, it'll work on anyone." Leon left the diner with a copy of her documents and a different kind of weight in his chest. It wasn't just about fences now. It was about precedent. His case had become a blueprint, for them or for others who might stand their ground. That night, Leon gathered every document he'd collected, every photo, every timestamp, and organized them into a hard drive. He delivered it to Dana in person the next morning, along with Catherine's findings. Dana didn't react outwardly, but he saw her eyes shift, the kind of look someone gets when the puzzle starts to come together in ways they didn't expect. The next legal move was swift. Dana filed a protective motion with the state land board, not the local court. It bypassed the slower, corrupt-friendly county system and forced a higher level of scrutiny. The motion wasn't for ownership. It was for environmental and historical easement preservation, citing legacy land use dating back 3 generations, backed by federal rural protection clauses. It was smart. It caught the company off guard. 3 days later, the work stopped. No crews, no trenching, no new surveillance installations. The gate remained, but the pressure paused. Leon used the quiet to reinforce his own boundaries. New fencing, stronger locks, and signs installed not for warning, but for legal evidence. Every corner of his property now bore laminated language. Legacy easement active. Interference subject to civil penalty. He didn't celebrate. He waited. And then, one morning, his water stopped running. The pump hadn't failed. His generator was fine. But when he checked the wellhead, he found the pipe capped. Clean, deliberate, sealed with industrial resin. Not sabotage, not vandalism, precision. Someone had turned off his supply from the source without leaving a trace. He stood there, wind scraping across the open field, staring at the capped pipe like it was a bullet in a message he couldn't yet read. They weren't done. They were just shifting tactics. And Leon realized with cold clarity that the second half of this fight wasn't going to be about fences or signs. It was going to be about survival. The water wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an inflection point. For a man who lived on the land, water wasn't luxury, wasn't comfort, it was viability. No water meant no cattle, no crops, no cooking, no bathing. More than that, it meant exposure. It meant he had to react. And reaction was exactly what they were baiting him toward. Leon stood for a long time beside the capped wellhead, running his hand along the glossy synthetic surface of the resin that sealed his pipe like a mausoleum lid. The resin wasn't something you found in a hardware store. It was commercial grade, used in industrial plumbing or covert infrastructure work. Whoever had done this hadn't just trespassed, they'd come equipped, knowledgeable, and quiet. Leon didn't touch it, didn't try to chip it away or inspect the depth of the seal. That would be too easy to misframe. He knew how fast the developers would twist any action into tampering with utility infrastructure. It would be written up, filed, presented in court as the act of a hostile property owner resisting modernization. So he did what he had come to learn mattered most. He documented. Camera, date, time, GPS coordinate, full walkthrough, no missing links. He emailed the package to Dana and included Catherine for redundancy. Then, with a separate camera in hand, he recorded a slow pan of the affected area, speaking aloud as he did so. Subject: illegal utility interference on private well. Suspected unauthorized capping with high-density epoxy. No permit posted. No prior notice. Nearest service tag found 32 yards east, outside property boundary. The voice on the video was calm, but in his chest the heat was building. This was no longer quiet encroachment. It was siege. And what he couldn't afford, what he refused to allow, was to be cast as erratic, reactive, or emotional. Because that's what they wanted, to isolate him, label him uncooperative, unstable, and slowly turn public opinion in their favor. His silence was already being spun that way. In the last week alone, 3 small editorials had popped up in regional media, questioning the resistance of legacy landowners to critical infrastructure expansion. One even referred to Leon's property as dormant acreage. Dormant. That word stuck with him as he sat by the pump shed, drinking black coffee from a steel thermos, watching the western sky darken with a pre-storm haze. Dormant was how they wanted him. Quiet, immobile, easily displaced. He was anything but. The next 48 hours became a blur of coordination. Dana escalated the legal filings, issuing a direct cease and desist to Crescent Ridge's utilities subcontractor, with a second emergency motion sent to the State Water Board. Catherine, meanwhile, tracked down a whistleblower from a prior Crescent project, an ex-employee who had left after objecting to some of the same tactics now unfolding on Leon's land. They spoke via a secure call. The man's voice was distorted, but his statements were clear. They don't just test boundaries. They design around assumed surrender. If you don't act, they build. If you act too loud, they pivot and sue. They're not just buying land. They're buying compliance. By the third day, Leon had a water truck delivered from a rancher friend 2 counties over. It wasn't a long-term solution, but it allowed him to refill troughs, keep the cattle stable, and avoid panic. He used the time to prep. Inventory, fuel storage, backup generator alignment, tool checks, not out of paranoia, but because he'd stopped waiting for support. The law would arrive too late. Help would come only when it was politically convenient. Until then, it was up to him to hold his line. That night, the wind changed. It wasn't just the direction. It was the weight of it, thick with electricity, a pressure front that pressed down across the hills like the hand of something ancient. Around 1 a.m., the motion sensors near the south fence tripped twice. Leon got up from his cot in the barn, boots already beside him, shotgun in hand. Not for use, but for posture. He checked the feed and saw what he expected. A black pickup, parked just beyond the edge of the cameras, lights off, 2 figures exiting the cab and moving toward the far gate. They weren't vandals. Their posture was too careful, too rehearsed. One held a clipboard, the other carried a field scanner. This wasn't trespass. It was survey work. Unmarked at night on land they had no legal right to examine. They weren't afraid of being caught. They believed no one would stop them. Leon stood in the shadows until they crossed the fence line. Only then did he step forward, flashlight in one hand, weapon slung but visible. "Can I help you?" he said, loud and even. The 2 men froze. One turned his head but didn't respond. The other, older, raised the clipboard. "Environmental review," he said. "Preliminary work. It's scheduled under Regional Development Phase 3. Leon stepped closer, light centered on their faces. "Got a permit?" The man lowered the clipboard slightly, eyes scanning Leon's silhouette. "We're subcontractors. This area's marked for coordinated access. We were told it was cleared." "By who?" The man didn't answer. "You have 30 seconds to clear off my land," Leon said, voice like flint. "Next time you set foot here without paper, I call it in as criminal trespass. You get a sheriff at your front door, and I get another motion in court with your names on it." They left without a word. The next day, Leon made good on the promise. Dana filed a trespass affidavit with attached photographic evidence and logged it with both the sheriff's office and the state auditor's office. Catherine forwarded the incident to a landowner advocacy group that tracked violations. Names were exchanged, footprints mapped. And for the first time in weeks, Leon saw the first real sign of retreat. But retaliation came in different form. 3 days later, a noise ordinance violation notice appeared nailed to his gate. It cited excessive use of unauthorized machinery after hours and non-compliance with regional community codes. The notice bore the letterhead of a private civil review board, an entity that had no jurisdiction over his property. When he contacted the listed office number, the call was rerouted 3 times and finally dropped. Then came the social push. An anonymous forum thread circulated on local community networks, labeling Leon as a hostile actor, accusing him of harassment, and even suggesting he'd threatened a crew with a weapon. None of it could be traced. None of it could be disproven easily. But the message was clear. They were shifting from legal pressure to reputational warfare. Leon responded the only way he knew how, by staying visible and unmoved. He filed formal complaints. He sent letters to the county commission demanding inquiry. He contacted the state AG's office. Every action, no matter how small, became a message. I am still here. I am still watching. I am not going anywhere. And finally, after everything, the capped well, the night surveyors, the notices, the erosion of support, he made the choice he had been avoiding, not because it wasn't justified, but because he'd hoped it wouldn't be necessary. He rolled open the northern storage bay, pulled off the tarp, checked the hydraulic pressure, the tread alignment, the engine seals. It was old, scarred, and absolutely legal. The armored vehicle sat there like a fossil with a purpose, a Cold War relic he had acquired under full documentation as a collector's item, maintained for demonstration and emergency use. Never fired, never used in threat, but built to last longer than the battles it was made for. He fueled it, started it, let the engine hum low and deep like a sleeping animal roused. And then he waited, because the next move was theirs. And they were running out of quiet ways to win. The next move came at dawn, not with machines or men in uniforms, but with silence. There was no engine noise, no flashing lights, no posted notice. Just the unmistakable realization that Leon's road had been removed from existence. Not blocked, not gated, erased. Overnight, the narrow trail that had always served as the lifeline to his northern pasture, the route for livestock transport and feed delivery, had been scraped bare, regraded, and cut in two by a trench over 3 feet deep, lined with cable tubing and construction mesh. His driveway had been amputated from the surrounding roadways and converted into something no longer recognizable. Whatever rights he held to access were now a memory buried beneath dirt and plastic. This was no longer an intimidation tactic. It was a declaration of ownership. Leon stood at the edge of the trench, hands clenched at his sides, jaw stiff against the cold morning air. The tire tracks leading up to the site were fresh. A flatbed had hauled out something heavy, likely one of the bulldozers parked near the development zone 3 miles east. No workers were present now, but the machines had done their work. They had severed him cleanly from his own world. There was no point in calling the sheriff again. That office had grown quiet weeks ago. Dana had already warned him. The deeper the money ran, the less responsive the system would become. Leon didn't scream, didn't curse, didn't film a viral tirade or pound on doors. He turned, walked back to the barn, and began his checklist with surgical calm. Fuel stores topped, hydraulic fluid stable, breakpoints tested, pressure levels green. He worked not in rage, but with precision, the same way his father had taught him to mend fencing and repair engines, not emotionally, but correctly. Inside the reinforced shed sat the most misunderstood object in his possession. It wasn't technically a tank, though that's what people called it. It was a decommissioned military APC, armored, diesel-fed, and registered as a historical vehicle. He'd bought it from a surplus auction over a decade ago, not as a weapon, but as a machine that reminded him of what it meant to be permanent. It was ugly, loud, and built to survive terrain that most men would call impassable. He'd always joked that if civilization ever collapsed, he'd still be able to reach town in under an hour. That morning, it wasn't a joke. He drove it slowly, not down the main road, but through the back pasture, where the grass was dry and the cattle watched with mild confusion. He kept the speed low, the engine purring like a sleeping bear. There was no need to rush. If they wanted a spectacle, they'd get one. The gate, gleaming, corporate, smug, came into view like a wound dressed in chrome. He'd counted 3 cameras last week, likely more now. Let them watch. Let them document. He wasn't hiding. When he reached the gate, he stopped, climbed down, walked the perimeter. No identification tags, no installation permit. Just branding and a keypad that now blinked red, waiting to deny him. He tapped the steel with his knuckles. It was hollow in places, cheap fabrication dressed in expensive polish. His hand rested on the latch. Then he stepped back, climbed aboard the vehicle, and started forward. The sound was seismic, not because of destruction, but because of rejection. Rejection of every inch of quiet submission they had hoped to cultivate in him. The gate didn't explode, didn't shatter in a fireball of cinematic flair. It buckled. It bent in the middle like a spine pressed too far. The concrete footing cracked. The hinges snapped like brittle bone. The keypad flew off in two directions, landing in the scrub grass on either side of the ruined path. The vehicle rolled through without pause, over the wreckage and across the boundary they had drawn without consent. He parked just past the threshold, climbed down again, stood in the center of the access road. The cameras blinked. Somewhere, someone was making calls. Good. Dana received the email at 8:46 a.m. A forwarded complaint from a private security contractor representing Crescent Ridge Holdings. The language was furious, performative, thick with accusation. Malicious destruction of property. Aggressive incursion into a protected site. Endangerment of private contractors. Dana responded with a 3-line rebuttal, attaching 17 pages of dated legal notices, maps, and a still shot from Leon's drone footage showing the illegal encroachment onto his land. She then filed for an emergency declaratory ruling from the state attorney's office on unlawful obstruction of a legally documented right-of-way. That same hour, Catherine pushed the footage to a network of landowner rights organizations across the western states. By noon, Leon's inbox was full, not with messages of outrage, but requests for comment. Journalists, independent researchers, even a few sympathetic officials now had undeniable proof that this wasn't about progress. It was about erasure. The company countered within 24 hours. A cease and desist was delivered by courier, sealed and notarized, citing willful property damage and disruption of pending development. They underestimated the response. Dana filed a countersuit before sundown. Not for money, for injunction. She brought up the illegal trenching, the capped well, the removed cameras, and the falsified notices. She cited case law dating back to the 1960s protecting legacy access routes from infrastructural overreach. She quoted the Federal Preservation of Landholder Rights Act. She called for an immediate halt to all development activity until a full forensic review of the site could be conducted by the state. Crescent Ridge Holdings, for the first time, faltered. They did not respond. Not immediately, because now they were exposed, not just to Leon but to the courts, the press, and other landowners watching with growing suspicion. And then came the final attempt to silence him. 2 nights later, an unmarked SUV arrived just past midnight. It parked on the edge of the trench near the severed road, lights off. Leon, still sleeping in the barn, was already awake by the time he heard the engine. He didn't go outside with a weapon this time. He stayed in the dark, watched. 2 men exited the vehicle. They didn't approach the house. They didn't speak. One placed something into the dirt. A small, narrow object, shaped like a spike. It wasn't there to damage. It was symbolic. A message. Leon retrieved it after they left. It was a branded stake used in commercial surveying. On it was a number, the parcel code for his land, rewritten with a hyphen that denoted pending acquisition. It wasn't a tool. It was a claim, a forecast, an insult. He took it into the barn, broke it over his knee, burned it. The next day, a hearing date was set. The state judge agreed to review the emergency injunction within 7 days. Dana prepared the materials with surgical intensity. Catherine compiled the full dossier of related cases. Leon, meanwhile, remained on his land. Water delivery restored. Access road functional. Fence repaired. Cameras reset. And through it all, the gate remained where it fell. Twisted metal, half submerged in dirt and gravel like a monument to everything they had failed to control. He didn't remove it. It stayed. As proof. as a line, as warning. The hearing didn't bring justice in the sweeping cinematic sense Leon might have wished for, but it brought something better. Precedent. The judge, a middle-aged man with a quiet demeanor and an expression carved by years of dealing with bureaucratic maneuvering, took less than an hour to reach his preliminary ruling. He cited cumulative evidence of encroachment, documentation inconsistencies from Crescent Ridge Holdings, unauthorized construction across protected easements, and a pattern of deliberate exclusion of the property owner from infrastructure. Decisions he did not praise Leon. He did not condemn the developers with fiery rhetoric. He did something far more dangerous to them. He ordered a complete freeze on the project, effective immediately, pending further review by the State Environmental Oversight Board and Land Regulation Committee. No more digging. No more testing. No access modifications. Any further action by the development firm without explicit state approval would trigger contempt charges and possible criminal liability. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a line in stone. The company's legal team responded in carefully measured tones, expressing surprise at the confusion and promising full cooperation with the review process. But those closest to the operation, Dana, Catherine, and even Leon, knew what that really meant. They'd been caught, and for a machine built to operate in silence, exposure was fatal. Over the next few weeks, local articles shifted tone. What had started as abstract commentary on rural resistance became investigative reporting. Anonymous sources began leaking internal memos. Catherine connected with a national publication, and a full-length piece was commissioned. Whispers became noise. Suddenly, Leon wasn't just a non-compliant landowner. He was a man who had stood his ground while others folded under pressure, who hadn't shouted or flailed or begged, but documented, defended, and refused to vanish. His story wasn't just personal now. It was political, a symbol, a flashpoint. But Leon didn't care about any of that. What mattered was that the trench was filled in, properly this time by a neutral third-party contractor under court supervision. What mattered was that the gate remained where it had fallen, not just because he'd left it there, but because no one dared to try reinstalling it. What mattered was that the water flowed again, restored not by secret crews at night but by order of a compliance officer with a clipboard and a visibly nervous manner. They'd tried to take the land by attrition. Instead, they gave him confirmation of ownership that no judge, no company, no public sentiment could undo. And yet, the scars were real. Trust didn't come back. The old rhythms of town life never fully returned. Some neighbors still looked at him differently, like they weren't sure whether to admire him or fear what he represented. A few stopped speaking to him altogether. The feed store resumed deliveries, but they left the receipt on the edge of the truck now, no handshake. Leon noticed, but he didn't press. He'd given up too much energy already trying to read the intentions of people who watched trouble unfold and chose silence. He didn't rebuild the gate. He reinforced his own fencing, added gravel to the northern road, repaired the barn's second stall. The cattle stayed calm. Murphy grew older, slower, still loyal. The hills were the same, and in the evenings when the wind pushed down through the trees and across the dust, Leon stood on the porch and breathed in the silence he'd preserved, not untouched, but intact. In the mail one day came a letter, not from the company, not from the state, but from a landowner in another county, a woman whose property had been named in a Crescent Ridge planning document. She'd read about Leon, asked if he'd be willing to speak to a group of families facing similar pressure. Leon didn't write back, but he kept the letter. And one night he opened a second drawer in the barn's side office and placed it carefully alongside the survey maps and drone footage. It wasn't over, not for him and not for others. They would come again, if not here, then somewhere else, different name, different shell.